The development context of Vampire's Bloodlord Rising gives me the feeling of a project that found its own identity along the way. And curiously, this usually works out when the studio has a clear vision of what they want to deliver at launch. The publisher has already made it clear that the game was delayed to the 30th of January 2026 to gain polish and incorporate community feedback via playtests. So there is an air of let's arrive more ready rather than simply pushing the game out the door. From what has been disclosed, you can feel that Mehuman Games is trying to balance two worlds: the sandbox appeal of building, management, castle, clan, stations, with a vampire power fantasy that needs to be more than just cosmetic. In other words, it doesn't seem like they just want to put a vampire skin on a generic loop. They want being a vampire to change how you play and how the world reacts to you. This emphasis appears both in the idea of building a castle as the center of your survival and in the focus on dominating the territory of Sangavia. Playing the demo and sticking only to what was officially shown, the part that sells the project to me the most is the duality of forms: vampire and disguised noble. To me, this is one of those design hooks that explains a lot of the rest of the game. Commerce and social interaction become more human, while the predatory criminal part becomes more vampire. And the consequence of this is the escalation of threats like hunters and when you go too far. If this is well tied together at launch, it could become the differentiator that separates the game from the sea of survival and crafting titles. At the same time, you can tell they made an important decision mid-development, distancing themselves from the Dynasty label. The name change from Vampire Dynasty to Vampire's Bloodlord Rising doesn't sound like empty marketing. It sounds like a repositioning to align expectations because the people involved commented that the strong focus on story and action-adventure didn't match what is expected of a Dynasty game. And that is healthy, because nothing kills a game faster than the audience buying into the wrong idea. The delay also fits well with the reading that this is a game that needs time to iron out the kinks of its systems. Combat, melee, and magic, progression, servant, minion management, and reactive attacks feel like a set that only truly works when the balancing is on point. Toplitz explicitly spoke about polishing and incorporating playtest feedback, so it seems they are trying to avoid that type of launch where the foundation is good, but everything feels a bit raw and misaligned. My feeling with Vampire's Bloodlord Rising, just from the demo and what the developer showed, is it has a very interesting skeleton and a clearer identity after the rebranding. And the delay suggests they know they need to truly finish the game before putting it on the street. If the launch on the 30th of January 2026 delivers a satisfying loop between castle building, clan management, and vampire power with real consequences, it could become that type of game you play thinking, okay, now I understand their plan. Based on the material released so far, Vampire's Bloodlord Rising wants to tell a very classic Rise story, waking up weak, rebuilding power, dominating territory, but with that flavor of moral choice between being a tyrant or a protector. That could work very well if the consequences are real in the open world. The premise that hooked me the most is playing as Dragos, a guy who was human, survives an attack, and becomes a vampire, but still carries this idea of responsibility toward the people of Sangavia, which already creates an interesting internal conflict for the story, because a benevolent vampire almost always needs to justify every concession they make to their own hunger. In the demo, the beginning conveys this feeling of being a piece on a larger board with older vampires and a hierarchy that couldn't care less about your will, and this appears especially in how the game speaks of Elder Fire and how Dragos respects this status. The way this is presented, it seems the plot will revolve not only around defeating Inquisition hunters, but asserting yourself politically within this ecosystem of monsters. The narrative hook of rebuilding the castle also doesn't sound like just a mechanic. The idea of the castle core being hungry for blood, which you feed to unlock regions and regain power, gives it an air of a curse that helps the game have a darker identity than just survival with a vampire skin. It's the kind of thing that, if the script ties it together well, transforms progression into story and not just a checklist. Another thing I liked in what was shown is the promise of heavy choices. Who lives, who dies, who becomes an eternal follower. And the game selling itself as a cinematic story with decisions that define the fate of Sangavia. However, here is my hesitation. Up to the demo, you can feel the potential, but you can't be certain yet if this goes beyond dialogue variations and reputation, or if it really changes missions, factions, and endings in a way that makes you want to replay it. And there is a detail that for me is gold for narrative to work in a sandbox. The aspect of switching forms, like a noble aristocrat to interact and a more predatory mode to do the dirty work, is perfect for creating situations of social masking, lies, and paranoia. And this fits perfectly with a story of a vampire trying to dominate a place without becoming a target for everyone at the same time. The sensation that remains is that the game is setting up a story of power and identity. You wake up weakened, grow again, face resistance, and decide what kind of monster you want to be while expanding dominion in Sangavia. If the final version delivers real consequences and memorable characters in this conflict, ancient vampires versus humans versus your own ambition, the script could step out of the generic gothic and become a very interesting journey. The gameplay, from what could be felt in the demo, seems like a pretty direct combo of open world RPG with light survival and base management, but tied together by a vampire fantasy that actually changes how you interact with the map. The loop is very clear. Go out at night to hunt for resources, return to strengthen your castle and your influence, and repeat this while the game throws threats at you. What caught my attention the most is the idea of alternating between a social form and the vampire form, because this gives the game its own face. Instead of just being kill everything, you feel there are times when you need to play it cool, observe, and plan. In the demo, this stance switching makes the experience feel less like a pure action game and more like a game of infiltration and risk control, especially with the notion of suspicion and the chance of attracting hunter attacks if you go overboard. In combat, the impression is of something more AA. There is melee and magic, and you can see they want to convey the feeling of vampire power growing over time. But it doesn't yet feel like that type of super precise and polished fight found in a game focused solely on that. Still, I liked how the threat of vampire hunters works as a natural break. You can even solo and go around dealing damage, but the game nudges you to think about the cost of that to your dominion. The castle building part is honestly where I see the game gaining many hours of life, and the official material hits this note hard with multi-story castles, decorative pieces, and a big focus on gothic medieval customization. Even playing just the demo, you can feel that the base isn't just eye candy. It is your center of progression and comfort, that place where you return to reorganize and feel that you are getting stronger. The follower management also looks promising because the proposal is for you to decide who becomes an eternal follower and use their strengths and weaknesses, which could become a cool strategic layer if the game really demands choices and not just recruit for the sake of recruiting. The way it was disclosed, this speaks to the fantasy of being a true vampire lord, not just a guy with a vampire skin crafting wood in the bush. Exploration was another point that left me wanting to see more. The world promises variety, mountains, forests, swamps, dungeons, and rewards for scouring the map. And this is the kind of promise that, in a demo, you only get a taste of. And the ability to control a bat to fly over areas has everything to be that feature you use. As much for utility as for the vibe, crossing the map through the night is much more thematic than dry fast travel. Overall, the feeling is that the gameplay will be you create your own vampire routine, hunt blood, expand territory, build an absurd castle, and deal with the consequences when you draw too much attention. If the combat polish and interface come in smooth at the launch on the 30th of January 2026, I can see this game becoming a very specific addiction for those who like base building with a strong identity and not just another generic survival game. The graphics give off a very open-world gothic vibe that works more through atmosphere than that obsession with hyper-realism. I didn't walk away thinking, wow, this is the new standard of the generation, but I walked away thinking that the game knows exactly the mood it wants to sell. Night, fog, shadowy forest, and that decaying medieval look. What holds the visuals together the most is the lighting and the use of fog, shadows to give depth, because this helps hide limitations and, at the same time, reinforces the nocturnal predator theme. You can notice that the studio spoke of improvements in lighting and fog behavior, and this makes a difference precisely in these scenarios that depend on mood. Regarding the environments, I would say the world has very beautiful moments, especially when vegetation, water, and that cold palette come together. But the consistency still seems like a game in evolution, with some areas looking more polished than others. There was also talk of improvements in materials and textures, including construction elements, and this is important because you will be staring at your castle for hours. Speaking of the castle, the art direction of the building pieces and decoration is where I feel the game can shine, because the proposal of assembling a multi-story Gothic castle fits perfectly with a heavier and more theatrical look. Even with what has been shown so far, you can already imagine those corridors by candlelight, huge halls, and that my home is a luxury mausoleum aesthetic. Regarding characters, I have mixed feelings. Dragos has a more virile and haunting design after the overhaul they mentioned, and this helps sell the protagonist better as a vampire lord. At the same time, since it is a game seen very up-close third-person, lots of focus on interaction, any stiffness in animation or expression stands out more than in games with a more distant camera. The interface also influences how people perceive graphical quality, and I found it interesting that they spoke of a totally overhauled user interface because bad UI ruins the feeling of production even when the scenery is beautiful. In demos, these things usually seem temporary, so if this overhaul is truly smooth at launch, the general presentation could rise significantly. For me, the visuals of Vampire's Bloodlord Rising are at that point where it convinces through identity. It wants to be dark, elegant, and a little dirty, and in that, it succeeds. If the final version keeps the promised improvements, textures, lighting, details like grass and water, and polishes the consistency, it has everything to look good enough and, more importantly, memorable for its atmosphere. The performance gives me that classic feeling of an ambitious open-world game. When it runs smoothly, it flows well, and it's easy to get into the mood. When it stutters, you are instantly reminded that there is still a lot of systemic stuff running underneath. And since the launch is scheduled for the 30th of January 2026, I am left with that cautious optimism that the final build will be more stable than the demo. The first warning sign for me is the game's own positioning. It relies on simulation, village, commerce, followers, and this usually weighs more on the CPU than we expect, even when the graphics don't seem absurd. In practice, it is the type of game where you don't just suffer when there is an explosion on screen. Sometimes the problem appears when you return to the castle and the game is calculating a bunch of things at the same time. Another thing that raises an eyebrow is the hardware requirements circulating in the community, with people questioning RAM requirements and the justification of ensuring a stable experience. This usually indicates that the studio is trying to protect itself because they know optimization can still vary quite a bit from machine to machine. It is not proof that it will run poorly, but it is that type of conversation that only appears when people are already feeling some kind of heaviness or inconsistency. In what I played, I also feel that some drops tend to appear in predictable moments. Area transitions, sections with lots of vegetation and fog, and when the castle starts to get more complex, more pieces, more things happening. This speaks to the proposal of building insane castles and having hunter attacks, because the more systems together, the greater the chance of a bottleneck if optimization isn't sharp. If the studio manages to deliver a build at launch with less stutter and with well-explained graphical options, the kind of thing that prevents people from hunting for secret settings, I think the conversation changes quickly, because the game looks like one that people play for dozens of hours. But today, the personal impression that remains is you can have fun in the demo, but performance still seems like a work in progress, and it's worth entering the launch prepared to tweak settings and wait for initial patches. Is it worth buying Vampire's Bloodlord Rising at launch? Yes. If you enjoy participating in the start of the journey in early access and accept rough edges, patches, and possible balancing changes, otherwise, the smartest choice is to wait a few months. What can be stated with safety is that the game is selling itself as a dark, open-world adventure with a loop of hunting for blood, fighting, crafting, and primarily building and customizing a castle with many construction and decoration elements. To buy at launch, the main yes for me is it already arrives with this very clear power fantasy, you are a vampire lord, exploring the world and using vampire abilities, including bat form to cross the map. And this usually is the type of thing that when the movement and combat click, becomes addictive quickly. Now, the main no is precisely the early access label. This almost always means systems still in adjustment, content that will grow slowly, and that classic risk of what looks incredible in the trailer becoming repetitive if the missions, AI, and combat don't have enough depth on day one. The game is indicated for those who like sandboxes with progression and base building, who enjoy the fantasy of I will build my lair, get stronger, and dominate the map. And for those who are also up for co-op, the release material cites cooperative multiplayer for up to 4 players. I would not indicate it for now. If you are the type who buys expecting a super polished campaign, full of closed content and without major changes, the very strategy of polishing and the history of delaying to gain more time already scream better wait for reviews and updates. I, personally, would only buy at launch if I were in the mood to follow a project in evolution and perhaps play with friends, because the open world plus vampire plus castle package hooks me easily, but if I were to buy only one game this month and demand high polish, I would wait for at least the first major updates post early access launch.